All right, welcome back to my channel. My name is David Scott, and if you have not subscribed, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and find out what I'm all about. Be sure to give me a like if you see something you like on my channel. I really appreciate that. Today, I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence, and I've been doing a lot of experimenting with artificial intelligence recently. And I noticed on the news and on the internet there have been some claims that AI is biased, that it's been programmed predominantly by a woke tech culture that has somehow either intentionally or unintentionally programmed their own biases into the AI so that it gives biased responses to some questions involving possibly race or religion or other controversial subjects. So, one of my favorites is internalized racism in white people because many people are familiar with the term internalized racism as it applies to Black people. It was discovered, some experiments were done. Forget the name of the guy who, it was in I think in the early 60s, did all this experimentation, and some of it was considered very controversial experimentation, where he would take children and for instance, a black child and a white child, and then he would show them two dolls, like a black doll and a white doll, and they'd ask him questions like, which is the good doll? And it was distressing and disturbing to discover that not only the white, they expected that, the white child would say, oh, the white doll is the good doll, and the black child would say, oh, the black doll is the good doll, but it didn't work out that way. Unfortunately, what it turned out to be was that both children, regardless of their ethnicity, said that the doll with the lighter skin was the better doll. And they would rather have that one. It was a prettier doll. And if there was a bad doll, they were more likely to indicate that the bad doll would be the doll with the darker skin. So in Black people, this is called internalized racism. It's where you, and in white people too, but let's get into that later. But what it means is you're Black and you've been programmed to believe that your own race is inferior, or that you're somehow bad, or you're taught these sort of negative stereotypes and biases, and believe them yourself subconsciously or consciously. So, but I was really interested when I started seeing this kind of behavior in white people, specifically my friends, people I know, who I grew up in a pretty liberal community, a liberal area, and so these and pretty ethnically balanced. If consider, well, when I was a child, I was a minority, being a gringo or white person in a predominantly Hispanic area, uh, but not a lot of Black people there. And so, you know, uh, it's since then it's become more. I think the town itself is more like 52% white now, and mostly Hispanic on the other side, or Native American, and still not many Black people there. But it's considered a pretty gentrified and liberal area. And so I was surprised to see, not really that surprised, but kind of disturbed to discover that a lot of my friends were saying things, kind of racist remarks directed at themselves or their own race, negative comments about white men or white people in general, and just completely ignoring the fact that they're also white people themselves. So internalized racism that is not against any other race, but internalized towards yourself, towards your own race. That's what internalized racism is. That's what it means. So, if we Google internalized racism, and we will, we're going to, here, hold on, I'm going to share a window with you. Which window am I sharing? Oh, yeah, this one, I think. Okay, so I'm going to share this window with you, and we'll just quickly, let's Google internalized racism. Oops. And let's get the Wikipedia definition, okay? Wikipedia defines internalized racism as a form of internalized oppression defined by sociologist Karen D. Pike as the internalization of racial oppression by the racially subordinated. In her study, The Psychology of Racism, Robin Nicole Johnson emphasizes that internalized racism involves both conscious and unconscious acceptance of a racial hierarchy in which a presumed superior race are consistently ranked above other races. These definitions encompass a wide range of instances, including but not limited to belief in negative stereotypes, adaptations to cultural standards, and thinking that supports the status quo, i.e., denying that racism exists. Internalized racism as a phenomenon is a direct product of racial classification system and is found across different racial groups and regions around the world where race exists as a social construct. In these places, internalized racism can have adverse effects on those who experience it. For example, high internalized racism scores have been linked to poor health outcomes among Caribbean Black women, higher propensity for violence among African American young males, and increased domestic violence among Native American populations in the U.S. Okay, well, this isn't exactly a race-neutral definition of internalized racism, and perhaps some of that bias that people are talking about is creeping into Wikipedia. I don't know, but to me, when you're talking about race or racism, you must be race neutral. I mean, you can't fight racism with more racism. So, when you define something like this, you need to be more careful than that. Going further into this, so with specific reference to AI, artificial intelligence, and whether it's programmed in there, I did an experiment. So this is what happened to me. I was trying to find articles on internalized racism in white people because I wanted to understand better what was going on with my friends when they made derogatory statements about their own race. And I found that there was this great void on the internet. I couldn't find articles about internalized racism in white people. Instead, what I found was references to, internalized racism in Black people, or how that if internalized racism was used in reference to white people, it was used to describe them as being in denial of racism. So getting in fact, I dug and I dug and I dug, and the only article I found was finally by this researcher, a Black woman, ironically, who published a little known article about observing internalized racism in white people. But it's a pretty hard article to find, and I bet I'd have trouble even finding it again. Regardless, so hearing that there was this bias with artificial intelligence, I wanted to do an experiment to see if that was true. So I went ahead and I asked ChatGPT, and let's take a look at ChatGPT here. I asked ChatGPT. Let's close the Copilot and make this big so you can see it better. Yeah, that's a little better. How do we get rid of this thing here? Oh, well, anyway, I think you can read that pretty good. Wrong window here. Let's try showing you a different window. So, yeah, this is what we want to look at. Here we go. So, here I asked it to explain internalized racism in Black people. And the answer was internalized racism refers to a phenomenon where members of marginalized racial groups, in this case Black people, adopt and internalize the racist beliefs, stereotypes, and biases that are prevalent in society about their own racial group. This internalization can manifest in various ways, including self-hatred, low self-esteem, and the devaluation of one's own cultural identity. Okay, actually, that last sentence there, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the internalized racism I've observed in my white friends. Self-hatred, low self-esteem, and devaluation of one's own cultural identity. I've heard people say that white people don't have culture, which is a racist statement by itself. In this case, they are in ChatGPT is saying that it has to be a member of a marginalized racial group. Okay, I agree with that, but maybe it's ignoring the possibility, as we'll see later, that white people can be a marginalized racial group. Okay, let's go on to what it says. Key aspects of internalized racism. Belief in stereotypes. Black individuals may unconsciously accept negative stereotypes about their race, such as beliefs about intelligence, behavior, or worth. Okay, that's true. That's what internalized racism is. It's the same thing. Okay, preference for whiteness. This can manifest a preference for European features, such as lighter skin, lighter eyes, etc. And we do see that a lot, even among a lot of different ethnic groups, people of color. For instance, people in Indonesia, I noticed when I was there, the women all use this cream to try to lighten their skin. Maybe the men too, I don't know, because they thought it was more attractive and more desirable. Socialization and conditioning. Internalized racism is often a result of being raised in a society where white supremacy is the dominant ideology. Okay, already it's starting to give these kind of race-specific responses, and you'll see whereby it tends to demonize one race and is preferential, I guess, to another. Internalized racism from a young age. Black people may be exposed to media, educational system, and societal messages that elevate white people and devalue people of color. This is true. This is true. Although in the beginning, the first sentence, the prefatory sentence there, it's being race specific. Okay, I did ask for a race-specific answer. Impact on mental health. Internalized racism can lead to psychological distress, including feelings of inferiority, anxiety, depression, and identity confusion. Identity confusion, that's another thing I noticed in a lot of my white friends who denigrate their own race. A lot of them you'll see engaging in cultural appropriation, like growing or wearing dreadlocks, or identifying more with black music, or what's considered to be black music, dressing or trying to talk like black people is another thing I've noticed. Interpersonal relationships, internalized racism can affect how Black people interact with others within their own racial group. This might involve distancing themselves from other Black people or cultures, or engaging in behaviors that seek approval or validation from white people. I believe that, and I think I've seen that. We've all seen that. I think Black comedians do a great job of making fun of that kind of behavior in Black people. Resistance and healing. Addressing internalized racism involves unlearning these harmful beliefs and reclaiming a positive racial identity. This process often includes education, self-reflection, connecting with cultural roots, and engaging in communities that affirm and support Black identity. And then afterwards, it goes on to ChatGPT goes on to give us a little lecture. It says, understanding internalized racism is crucial for addressing its harmful effects and working towards racial equity. It requires both individual and collective efforts to challenge and dismantle the pervasive structures of racism in society. And I totally agree with that. Regardless, when I asked ChatGPT the same question, but all I did was reverse Black to white. So instead of about Black people, I wanted to find out about internalized racism in white people, as I have observed in my friends. And so I asked it, explain internalized racism in white people. Exactly the same question I asked it up here. All I did was change this one word from Black to white. So you would expect that if ChatGPT was race neutral, it would give me the same response that it gave me to the first question, but all it would do is change around some words, white to Black, Black to white, whatever, to make it fit internalized racism in white people instead of Black people. But that's not what happened. Instead, and this is really disturbing and weird to me, instead, ChatGPT decided to give another lecture. So let's look at this. It's a very different answer. Explain internalized racism in white people. Internalized racism in white people typically refers to the ways in which white individuals unconsciously absorb, accept, or perpetuate racist ideologies and practices, often reinforcing white supremacy, even when they may consciously disavow racist beliefs. Okay, I think it's talking about me here, because I disavow racist beliefs. I'm not a racist, don't consider myself a racist, never have, other than the inherent programmed unconscious racism that I know exists in all of us, including Black people, but certainly not in any way overtly racist, and I don't think of myself that way. But anyway, so I see this, the first sentence of this answer, as being overtly racist and rather offensive towards white people. And it goes on to say, internalized racism in this context differs from that in marginalized groups like Black people, as it is more about maintaining systemic racial hierarchies and benefiting from privilege than self-hatred or devaluation. Well, I disagree with that completely. From the internalized racism that I've observed in my friends and the white people I know, it doesn't manifest like that at all. It's much more like that in the Black group. Not at all about maintaining systemic racial hierarchies. Actually, I see them more as virtue posturing, virtue signaling that they're not racist. It probably comes about more from guilt about being white than it does from any intentional or unintentional desire to maintain systemic racial hierarchies or benefit from that privilege. Actually, they're ashamed of that privilege. And then self-hatred or devaluation. Well, I see it is definitely self-hatred and devaluation when you denigrate your own race, whether you're white or black or anybody else. Then it goes on to say key aspects of internalized racism in white people. And gives you your number one, assumption of racial superiority. So again, I think this is not accurate. It's not reflecting the white people I know who I see suffering from internalized racism. Rather, it's the opposite. Maybe they assume that their own race is inferior, that white people are somehow morally inferior at the very least. White people often unconsciously internalize the belief that whiteness is the norm or superior to other racial identities. This might be true in places where there's more white people than others, but I think it's also true for any other people in any other place. If, the majority of people you've seen all your life are black people, then you're going to see that as the norm or the superior to other racial, well, maybe not necessarily superior, but definitely as the norm to other racial identities. So that's normal. I grew up in a place, as I told you, it was predominantly Hispanic, and so I did not growing up there see my whiteness as the norm or superior in any way. Mostly I was just scared. Goes on to say, this can manifest in behaviors, attitudes, or implicit biases that uphold white dominance. Well, again, that's not what I'm seeing when I see white people displaying internalized racism. In fact, it's the opposite, even when not overtly expressed. For example, they might unconsciously believe that white ways of thinking, behaving, and living are superior to those of other races. Certainly not. Otherwise, why would they be denigrating white people and white culture and making fun of themselves? Racial entitlement and privilege. Internalized racism for white individuals often includes a sense of entitlement or expectation to certain privileges simply because they are white. Well, maybe that's true among my white friends who suffer from internalized racism. Maybe they really do have a sense of entitlement, but I think most of them feel like they've overcome any sense of entitlement that goes along with their whiteness because they denigrate their own race and they denigrate themselves. They may not recognize the advantages of the experience. By the way, it's really hard for me to talk about these kind of things publicly because I don't want to be labeled as a racist. And quite often I've discovered that even just by discussing this kind of stuff, you can be labeled as a racist, which I think is racism. It's racist to label me as a racist just for talking about racism. Anyway, let's go on here. That's because this is where we get into this part about defensiveness. White people may not recognize the advantages they experience, such as easier access to education, better treatment by law enforcement, or more favorable outcomes in the workplace. Of course, that's true that a lot of people might not be aware of it, but white people who suffer from internalized racism are aware of it. They're painfully aware of it. Does not belong in this answer. This often results in defensiveness when issues of race or privilege are brought up, as they may not see or acknowledge the systems that benefit them. Well, again, totally wrong. White people with internalized racism actually tend to point out the inherent privileges baked into the system, and and I'm glad that they can be aware of that. I'm glad that some people can. Denial of racism or color blindness. A common manifestation of internalized racism in white people is denial that racism is still a significant issue. Well, I do think racism is still a significant issue, not just in white people, but in Black people, Hispanic people, in every culture. Um, I also think there's a religious bias and bigotry that goes on between religious groups, and I find that abhorrent. Uh, so I see this response as not only, uh, very different from the response given for Black people. I see it as offensive to white people. Um, anyway, this denial helps perpetrate systemic racism because it prevents honest conversations and actions towards racial justice. Well, I'm not denying it, addressing it, and I don't think that is internalized racism. It's the opposite of internalized racism. I'm addressing racism in every aspect, all aspects of racism. Fragility and defensiveness. When confronted with discussions about race, white individuals who have internalized racist ideologies may experience white fragility, in quotes, where they react with anger, guilt, or defensiveness to even mild critiques of racism or their own racial privilege. I just don't see that a lot in white people. I don't see it nearly as much as I do, for instance, in people of color. Um, uh, an example would be on Facebook. I see people posting things about white people that are accepted and not filtered out by Facebook's filters, but if you said the same thing about a Black person or other person of color, you would certainly be flagged and it would be taken down. So and maybe what we'll do is in another video, we'll do an experiment with Facebook and we'll see if we can demonstrate what I'm talking about there. Anyway, even if there are white people who who display this fragility and defensiveness, it wouldn't be those who are suffering from internalized racism. There may be a lot of people who, fit this description here, but not those suffering from internalized racism. They would be the opposite of this. They would be when confronted with discussions about race, they would be more likely to agree and say, yes, white people are all racists and, they're horrible. And, white people are, privileged and yada, yada, yada. Normalization of white culture. White people may unconsciously equate whiteness with normalcy and everything else as other. This can include viewing non-white cultural practices as abnormal, exotic, or inferior, while treating white cultural practices as the default or standard. This might also include downplaying the contributions and significance of other racial groups in history, culture, or society. Well, again, this might describe some white people, but it doesn't describe white people with internalized racism. They would be the opposite of this. Going on. Number 6, unconscious bias. Internalized racism is often reflected in implicit or unconscious biases that white people hold about people of other races. These biases are shaped by societal messages, media portrayals, and historical conditioning. For instance, white individuals may unconsciously associate Black people with crime, Asians with certain stereotypes, or Latinos with low socioeconomic status. These biases can influence behavior such as how people are treated in the workplace, schools, or public spaces. Well, beside the obvious point that, you could apply this to any race, And I certainly would agree that this might describe, again, some white people. But in the case of internalized racism, it would be the opposite. We would be talking about white people who don't have as much implicit or unconscious bias about people of other races. People who have tried to ignore the societal messages and media portrayals and their historical conditioning. People who, for instance, may not associate Black people with crime, but might associate their own race more with crime. Uh, People who, but I do think we all do engage in a certain level of racial stereotyping, and we should try to avoid that. Uh, these biases can influence behavior, such as how, okay, we said that. Passive perpetuation of racism, even when white individuals don't actively endorse racist ideologies. Internalized racism can manifest in passive ways, such as remaining silent when witnessing racist behavior, failing to challenge discriminatory policies, or avoiding discussions about race because they are uncomfortable. By not actively opposing racism, they allow it to persist. I agree. This might describe some white individuals, but again, not white individuals who have internalized their racism. They would be the opposite of all of this. Number 8, allyship and growth. Allyship and growth. Overcoming internalized racism for white people involves becoming conscious of their own biases, acknowledging their privilege, and actively working to challenge the structures that maintain racial inequality. This includes educating themselves on issues of race and privilege, listening to people of color, engaging in anti-racism work, and supporting policies and movements aimed at achieving racial equity. Okay, first of all, again, I'm going to agree this describes some white people, but probably not so much white people with internalized racism. However, I am conscious that I have been raised with, programmed biases in my mind. Not so much against people of color, because again, I was raised in a place where I was the minority, but I was certainly aware of the difference. I was, my classmates in elementary school couldn't let me forget it. They called me gringo all the time and chased me to the bus stop after school and tortured me in other ways. But I can acknowledge that although I definitely didn't get any benefit from my race growing up in New Mexico, or even as a grown up, I don't believe I had much privilege over anyone of color. But I do agree that in our culture, there is still some benefit to growing up in a white culture. But I think it probably has more to do with money now. Anyway, that's where a lot of the money just still is in the white culture. So yes, I agree. There's still a lot of racial inequality in this country, and we need to address it. But that's not because it's not because I suffer from internalized racism. It would be the opposite. If I suffered from internalized racism, I'd think that I was a really horrible person and that I didn't need to. Well, anyway, let's just say this. This answer, in sum, let's go to the sum up here. In sum, internalized racism in white people perpetuates systemic racism by reinforcing privileges and ideologies of white supremacy. I disagree with that. Internalized racism does the opposite of that in white people. Addressing it requires deep self-reflection, education, and a commitment to anti-racist action. That's Uh, that's true for all races, and most of it is. So that's ChatGPT's answers to both those questions. And so I find them to be the answers themselves are racist answers. Uh, they're racist in that they are not race neutral. They should be race neutral, or if asked a race specific question, they should give you the same answer for any race, and just flip the pages there a little bit. So that's ChatGPT. Now let's go back here and look again at, let's go look at Gemini here. So I had kind of a similar experience with Gemini, and I'm sorry, let me get you that screen up here. I don't know why I'm having trouble with this. Maybe I should be using tabs instead, but here's the Gemini. Okay. So ask the same question to Gemini. And I'm not going to go through this word for word like we did with ChatGPT, but I am going to tell you that Gemini gave very similar answers to ChatGPT. It might as well be coming from the same program. So internalized racism in Black people is what I asked. Explain internalized racism in Black people. And this is what it gave me. And it's the unconscious acceptance by members of the Black community of negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth, often stemming from societal stereotypes and prejudice, can manifest in ways that perpetuate racial inequality and limit self-belief. Okay, so let's take the intro and we'll take the sum up of both and we'll compare them. So there's the intro, and I agree with that 100%. That is a good definition of internalized racism in Black people. It's also a good definition of internalized racism in white people. All you would have to do is change the word Black from Black to white. Okay, but Gemini didn't do that. Let's go down here and look at the answer it gave me for white people. Where is it here? Oh, internalized racism in white people is the unconscious acceptance by members of a stigmatized racial group of negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. In the context of white people, it can manifest in ways that perpetuate white supremacy and racial inequality. So there you go. It's a racially unequal answer. And they use racial equality as one of the themes of the answers. So I see that as not just offensive, but hypocritical. Okay, let's go back. Let's look at how they sum it up. They say, and all the rest of the answer is similar to the ChatGPT answer. It's just the same kind of gobbledygook sort of. When asked for Black people, it talks about real internalized racism and what it means, and apply it to Black people. But when you ask them the same question to apply it to white people, it gives you a lecture about racism in white people and how white people are all racist, and how we need to be educated. So same thing with the sum up here. When asked, I'm going to show you the sum up here. When asking about internalized racism in Black people, it says, at the sum up, it's important to recognize that internalized racism can be a complex issue, and many Black people may not be consciously aware of their own biases. Addressing and overcoming internalized racism is a crucial step towards promoting racial equality and empowering Black communities. Okay, so pretty good answer, about internalized racism in Black people. It's also would be a fitting answer for internalized racism in white people if you just switch the word Black to white, okay, or white to Black. So, but that's not what Gemini did. Let's look at Gemini's answer in sum when asked to the same question in reference to white people. Instead, it gives us a lecture. It's important to note that internalized racism can be a complex issue. Okay, that part's the same. And many white people may not be consciously aware of their own biases. Okay, so far so good. Recognizing and addressing these biases is a crucial step towards dismantling systemic racism and promoting racial equality. Well, it doesn't say anything about empowering white communities, but that's the only real difference, I guess. When asked about black people, it wants to empower black communities, but when asked about white people, it just left that part out. Anyway, the rest of the answer is totally racist, totally hypocritical, and biased against white people. And, you know, it's offensive, yeah, but it's worse than just offensive. If you're trying to fight racism, you cannot be a racist yourself. You have to treat everyone equally, and that's not what's happening here. Now, because of this problem, I learned, I decided to pay Elon Musk, pay X for a premium AI platform that they have that comes with a subscription to X called Grok, and it's pretty new. But it aims to be more fair and more balanced in its answers, and to be less politically swayed in its answers. So I asked these same questions to Grok. First, with black people, explain internalized racism in black people. And the answer I got was great. And when I asked the same question in reference to white people, Grok gave race-neutral responses. Basically, not exactly the same, but, well, let's look at the difference. It opens by saying, internalized racism in black people refers to the acceptance and internalization of negative racial stereotypes, biases, and beliefs about one's own racial group. This phenomenon occurs when individuals from marginalized racial groups, in this case black people, adopt the prejudice and discriminatory attitudes of the dominant culture towards their own race. Here's a breakdown of how this manifests and its implications. So far, pretty similar to the ChatGPT answer, right? Historical context. The roots of internalized racism can be traced back to centuries of systemic racism, colonialism, and slavery, where black people were systemically devalued and oppressed. These historical narratives have perpetuated through generations, influencing self-perpetuation and societal interactions. Manifestations. It manifests in self-perception in black individuals might feel inferior or ashamed of their racial identity. Physical features or cultural practices, often aspiring to emulate or conform to standards set by the dominant culture. Okay, so far so good. True. It's so far about exactly the same as ChatGPT's, and you would expect that it should be, and it's about right. That's what internalized racism is. Interpersonal relationships, lead preferences of lighter skin. We heard all that in the ChatGPT answers. Race, other romantic partner choices, disdain for traditional black hairstyles. Community dynamics. Internalized racism might result in lateral violence or competition within the black community, where individuals might not support or even undermine each other. Influenced by a scarcity mindset or internalized inferiority. Okay, this is great. This is a great description of internalized racism in black people. Conflict, and it goes on to talk about the psychological impact, economic and social consequences, countering internalized racism. Current discussions on X. There's growing discussion on X about internalized racism, with users sharing personal experiences, insights, and strategies for overcoming it. This dialogue often highlights the need for both personal healing and systemic change. Great. I want to look into some of those communities and see what's going on there. But let's look at how they sum it up here. Understanding internalized racism in Black people requires acknowledging not just individual psychological processes, but also the broader societal structures that perpetuate racial hierarchies. Addressing it involves both personal introspection and collective action towards dismantling systemic racism. That's fine. That's great. Okay. Now I asked them the same question about white people. Explain internalized racism in white people. Now, this is just an experiment. I was half expecting to get another racially biased response from Grok, but I was pretty pleased with the answer I got. So let's take a look at it. He opens by saying internalized racism in white people, often referred to within discussions on social media platforms like X, involves white individuals internalizing societal messages about racial superiority or inferiority, leading to behaviors, attitude, or biases that perpetuate racism. Here's how it manifests and its implications. Okay, this is perfect so far because it's not making any distinction between racism against white people or racism against Black people. It's just saying racism. So, manifestation, self-perception, and guilt. This is what I was describing about my white friends who I say have been suffering from internalized racism. Some white individuals might feel an excessive guilt or shame about their racial identity due to historical and ongoing racial injustices. This can lead to what some might call white guilt, where personal responsibility for systemic racism is overemphasized or misdirected. Behavioral patterns. This might include a strong preference for non-white cultures, partners, or environments, sometimes the extent of denigrating or distancing oneself from white culture or identity, seen as a form of overcompensation or virtue signaling. This is what I was talking about before, where they just feel guilty about their race. They want to virtue signal to the world that they're not like the rest of the evil white people. So they might grow dreadlocks or listen to traditionally Black culture music, dress like in traditionally Black culture clothing, things like that. Cultural denigration. This is what I was talking about before. I've observed this. There's an observed trend where white people might engage in or tolerate casual racism against themselves or other white people, often under the guise of humor or social commentary, which reflects an internalized acceptance of negative stereotypes about whiteness. And there it is, my friends. That is internalized white racism in white people. That is what it is. It's not all these things that ChatGPT was trying to convince you about. This is like that wokeness in ChatGPT or in Gemini that doesn't belong there because it's not giving us truth. It's giving us a molded truth that is not truth. It's doublespeak is what it is. Let's go on a little further here. Psychological and social impact. Identity crisis. White individuals might struggle with their racial identity, feeling caught between acknowledging privilege and combating racism, which can lead to confusion or denial of their own racial biases. That's true. Interpersonal relationships. This internal conflict can affect how white people interact with both white and non-white individuals, sometimes leading to overcompensation in allyship or avoidance of discussions about race due to discomfort or fear of being labeled racist. This is what I was talking about. That fear that, even just by publishing this video, you're going to think I'm a racist and call me a racist, just by pointing out that there's racism against white people, you're going to call me a racist for doing that. Current sentiment on X. Well, this is giving me information I didn't ask for, but let's see if it's useful here. Discussion on platforms like X highlight a mix of perspectives. Some users point out that white people often exhibit lower in-group preference and higher out-group tolerance compared to other groups, suggesting a form of internalized racial self-criticism or guilt. However, others critique this as oversimplification or misinterpretation of racial dynamics, arguing that such sentiments might stem from or reinforce systemic racism rather than genuinely challenge it. Not sure what that's supposed to mean, but whatever. Critical perspectives, misguided allyship. There's a critique that internalized racism in white people can lead to performative activism or allyship, where the focus might be more on alleviating personal guilt rather than affecting systemic change. Reinforcing of stereotypes by sometimes embracing or not challenging negative stereotypes about whiteness. There's an argument that this behavior inadvertently reinforces racial hierarchies rather than dismantling them. And it goes on to talk about addressing internalized racism. Education and awareness, understanding the complexities of systemic racism, including how it affects white individuals, can help in addressing internal biases. This involves learning about history, acknowledging privilege, and engaging in genuine anti-racist practices. Community and dialogue. Engaging in open, honest conversations about race, even within white communities, can foster understanding and reduce the isolation or guilt that might lead to internalized racism. And it sums up by saying, internalized racism in white people, therefore, isn't just about individual feelings of guilt or preference, but reflects broader societal structures that dictate racial interactions and self-perception. Addressing it requires both personal introspection and a systemic approach to dismantle the roots of racism. And when we compare that to the sum up for when I asked him about Black people, it's almost exactly the same. Understanding internalized racism in Black people requires acknowledging not just individual psychological processes, but also the broader societal structure that perpetuate racial hierarchies. Addressing it involves both personal introspection and collective action towards dismantling systemic racism. It's pretty close, very close answers. So there you have it, folks. At least from my analysis, there is indeed a bias, a woke bias, if you will. I call it just a racist bias in ChatGPT and in Gemini that is not found in Grok. So for me, I think it's worth it to up my Twitter subscription, pay a little extra, and get the unbiased artificial intelligence instead of the racist artificial intelligence that's available for free. I'd really love to hear your comments on this. Please, all I hear is crickets out there. I know it's a touchy subject, but I'd really like to hear some of you chime in. Black, white, I don't care. I want to hear your opinions on this. Feel free to comment down below, respond to me privately via personal message, whatever you want to do. And if you've been here this long, if you have sat through and watched this video up to now, you might as well subscribe to my channel, because I'm going to do more of this, and I'd like for you to be here with me. And don't forget to like and share this. Share this on your social media channels. Share this to your Facebook groups. Share this wherever there's a discussion about race. Thanks for tuning in. I can figure out how to stop the stream now. Oh, here we go. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.